Probably goes off by itself after some.
You okay? How you doing? Doing good.
He will be here. That's fine. Yeah, that's why my hair.
Yeah, you're in Mark.
I do have a cat, but I don't think it's there. I think that's it looks like.
Yeah, you're in my class.
Yeah.
Well, you've caused enough mischief already, you might as well stay in there.
Yeah, been out the last couple of weeks, though, isn't it? Yeah, been out a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And, it was on Sunday. Monday.
You're right, it is. Exactly right. You're right.
Yeah. Right turn and right.
Not like I can get like a and then they usually make herself do Number one thing.
How did you find this one? Something on that? It says it right there. Good morning. Time for us to begin this morning. We're going to be in lesson 2 in our workbook, and lesson 2 covers chapters 3 through 6. We're going to look at chapters 3 and 4 today, and chapters 5 and 6 on Wednesday. I've asked Joe to lead us in prayer to begin our class, so Joe, if you would, please.
Let us pray together. So Lord, we are so thankful for the day that you have given to us, that we can come together and study another portion of your word and learn about your truths. And we are thankful for our teachers, not only this class, but in all our classes, that will help guide and lead the discussions and the studies for their respective lessons. And please be with John today and give him a good memory of the things he has prepared, that we can easily understand, and help us be not just merely an audience, but be active participants in this study, so we may learn from one another. Let us divorce from our minds anything that would be distracting us from learning more through your word. Pray and ask all these things in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Joe, especially for the good memory part. All right, on Wednesday we talked about chapters 1 and 2 of Ezra, and where were the returning exiles at the end of chapter 2? Look at verse 70, if you will. Where were they? Do what? All right, so they had sort of distributed themselves into the cities and towns around Jerusalem. Okay, what was the condition of Jerusalem at this time? It was a disaster. Let's turn over to 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Should be just a couple of pages back in your Bibles. And I want to read here, beginning in verse 17. It says, "Therefore he brought against them," that is, God brought against them, "the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hand, and all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious vessels." So when they returned to Jerusalem, what did they see? A city that is more or less level. Wouldn't be a place to live at all. And what about the temple? What was the condition of the temple? Just read it. The same thing, right? It had been burned. It had been destroyed, basically. Now, I think on Wednesday, Lee Moore may have made a comment about it. If you look a little bit further down in verse 21, it says that this is to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths, all the days that it lay desolate. It kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So the land was more or less unoccupied by God's will, for the purpose of the land resting to make up for the Sabbaths that these people had violated during the time that they lived in the land. So they came back to a city destroyed, a capital that was destroyed, and a land that was desolate, so that they went and occupied these towns that had not been destroyed, because my picture is Jerusalem probably could not be occupied without work at that time. All right, so let's look at our questions. I have a question, first of all, before we get to question 1. If you did not open your workbook and you did not answer the questions, raise your hand. Shame on you. John said we treat you like fifth and sixth graders. Now, I ask you, and I encourage you to do that. What I encourage you to do is read the scripture first that the lesson is covering, then read the writer's thoughts here. He has some good thoughts, some good ideas, and then answer the questions. Because as John has emphasized and I have emphasized, we will use the questions. So we're going to start with question 1. When did the Jews begin worshiping at the altar? All right, the 7th month. What kind of month is this? How was this month measured? Yeah, okay. It's the 7th month of the Jewish year. Sometimes you'll see a 7th month that refers to the reign of a king or something like that. This refers to the Jewish calendar, the 7th month. The 7th month was the month of Tishri. And as Dan said, it's equivalent to about our September, October. You know, their months don't exactly line up with ours, but it's about that. Question 2. Who was the leader? Who were the leaders of the restored exiles?
Zerubbabel and Joshua.
All right. Zerubbabel was sort of the leader of the people, and Joshua was the priest, the spiritual leader of the people. And what work did they lead here in chapter 3?
Building the foundation of the church.
They started the foundation of the temple, but before that, what did they do? They built an altar so that worship could be presented to God, so that sacrifices could be presented to God. So they thought that was important, that the worship of God began, even though there was no temple there at the time. They're going to begin the work, but there was no temple at the time, so they thought it was important that they did that. What important feast were observed in the 7th month?
Feast of Tabernacles.
Tabernacles or booths or whatever it's called, different things in different places. That's when the people lived in what I'd call a tent or a lean-to remember the time coming out of Egypt that they spent in the wilderness. But there were 2 other feasts that occurred in the 7th month, if you looked it up. Day of Atonement was worship celebrated in the 7th month or observed in the 7th month.
Hard to do that without a temple.
Do what?
Hard to do that.
Hard to do that without a temple, and that's why maybe there's no mention of the Day of Atonement here. And when they reestablished the worship, because remember the high priest on the Day of Atonement would have to go into the most holy place. Well, if there's no most holy place to go into, then that would be hard to do that. The other one was the Feast of Trumpets. It was also in the 7th month. So 7th month was a very important month in the Jewish calendar as far as worship goes. All right, question 5. I'm going to come back to question 4. Why was money collected at this assembly? They built the altar. They assembled the people from their towns where we read that they went. And why did they collect money?
To start the construction.
Yeah, for the construction, to begin the reconstruction of the temple. To begin the reconstruction of the temple. And then question 6 says, when was the foundation of the temple laid?
2nd month of the 2nd year that they returned.
Yeah, the 2nd month of the 2nd year that they returned. Now here's another time this is not the 2nd Jewish month. This is a measured month from the time they returned. So that would make it about 535 or 536 BC when they laid the foundation of the temple, when they began the foundation of the temple. I've put this little chart. You've seen it before, part of it. This is just part of it. It shows here that the decree of Cyrus, and there's where they began the temples by laying this foundation that they laid here in chapter 3. So about 535, 536. Again, these dates are all approximate. They look very official when they're written, but we really don't know exactly the year. But it's in that time frame that they began the temple. And then we'll get to this in a minute, but it's going to be discontinued just a year or so later. And then it's going to be a few years before it resumes and before it's finished. And we'll get to that. All right, question 7 says, how did the exiles celebrate the occasion?
Cymbals and trumpets.
Cymbals and trumpets. They were singing, they were playing, they were shouting. Let me, Luke, since you spoke up, read verses 10 through 13, if you will, of chapter 3.
And the builders laid the foundation of the temple of Yahweh, and the priests in their apparel with the trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with the cymbals, were positioned to praise Yahweh, as described by King David of Israel. And they sang responsively with praising and thanksgiving to Yahweh, saying, for he is good, for his loyal love is everlasting for Israel. And all the people responded with a great shout of joyful acclaim and praise to Yahweh, because the house of Yahweh was laid. But many of the elderly priests, Levites, and heads of the families who had seen the first temple wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house. But many shouted aloud with joy.
And 13.
No person could distinguish the sound of joyful acclaim from the sound of people weeping, so the people shouted with great joyful acclaim, and the sound was heard from afar.
Okay. So, this is quite a celebration, isn't it? They are celebrating the fact that the worship of God can begin again. They've built this altar. They're offering sacrifices. Now they've laid the foundation. These are all encouraging things for this group of exiles coming back. We said about 50,000 people, if you count the Israelites and their servants that came with them. That we don't know exactly who they were, but 50,000 people. Most of them probably would have gathered to Jerusalem at this time. So it's a great occasion, and it's a noisy one because it says the sound was heard far away. So even their neighbors might hear this joyous celebration that they make. All right. Look over at question 10. It says, why did the Jews refuse, and this is the offer of help from their people that lived near them, why did they refuse their help in the rebuilding of the temple?
Well, it said, the Jewish people that came back said, you have nothing in common with us. We don't want your help.
Okay. But they said, we've been worshiping your God just like you do. Well, maybe not just like, but they said they've been, was that true?
No. Not just like.
Yeah, I corrected about just like. Was it true they've been worshiping God? Somewhat. Somewhat true.
In their own way.
In their own way, and mixed with other things too that they were worshiping. So these were people who were not Jews. They may have been some of the predecessors of the Samaritans that we'll read about when we get into the New Testament. The Samaritans who were the Samaritans?
Those that had returned, exile there when the exile's gone and repopulated.
Sort of, the Jews would just regard them as half-breeds, wouldn't they? Because they're the result of, you remember when the northern kingdom was taken away by the Assyrians sent people to settle there. And then whoever was left in the land and those that settled there intermarried over time, and that's probably where the Samaritans came from. That would have been some of the people that would be offering to help here. So the Jews have rejected that because of their uncertain lineage.
Which makes the story of the Good Samaritan even more profound.
Yeah, yeah, very much more
if
profound.
you understand how looked down they were looked down upon.
Yeah, and in the time between the Testaments, the Samaritans actually built a temple for themselves on Mount Gerizim. So if you remember in John 4, when Jesus meets the Samaritan woman, he says to her something like, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will God be worshipped. And he's talking about the Samaritan temple, which the Jews helped to destroy. That created a lot of the ill will between the two. And so we see them there, and here we see them wanting to help. But if you look carefully, I think also if you look carefully at the decree, back in Ezra chapter 1, the Cyrus decrees, he says, whoever is among you, this is verse 3, of all his people, may God be with him and let him go to Jerusalem and rebuild the house of the Lord. So Cyrus's decree included what people to return and rebuild? The Jewish exiles, the Jews in exile. When he says his people, may God be with him, so his people would be the people of God, which the Jews would regard as their commission from Cyrus to go and do the work. So, for whatever reason, they don't want somebody else helping them. Yes, Mike?
Well, the New American Standard, verse 1 of chapter 4 says, now when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard about it and wanted to help. So they were already identified as not friendly.
Yeah, and English Standard says adversaries of the Jews. So these were people who didn't really want the Jews to succeed, and so maybe that was also part of the motive, that they might try to sabotage the work. Yes, Luke?
I do have a question about this, just because, you know, there's not a lot of instruction given from God, like when you go back, make sure you don't include any other nations. But if you look at some of the prophecies, like in Isaiah, you know, the restoration of Judah, like all nations will flock to the temple, you know, and things like that. So, and there's some other people that I've read that have a much stronger opinion about this. I really don't know which way to go, but it does kind of make you wonder, like, hey, we will come help you build. Can we, you know, could Israel have been the light to the nations that they were kind of always supposed to be? And instead they double down on their, we are the people of God, nobody else will be here. Again, there's not a lot of instruction given there, and I just always wonder about that, you know?
It's a fair question, but it almost seems like that at this point in time, Israel has not matured to the point to where they realize that that's what the prophecy of God means. So that they're very insular at this time. That's part of what causes their problems, is that because they're so insular, they're not reaching out to people. They're saying, you know, we're going to play in our sandbox and you stay away. And that's going to create adversaries.
And obviously that's part of God's plan, because when Jesus comes, that's, you know, the whole point is to say, actually, this is for everybody, and that's what gets him killed, is because he's trying to open up for everybody. But,
that's another 500 years.
Right. But I just wonder, you know, I fall short of giving a wholesale endorsement for all that the Jews did in their return. I think that's where my question is.
And I can't judge whether they're right or wrong in doing this.
Right. Yeah.
It's just a fact that that's what they did. And there's no comment about whether that was the right or the wrong thing to do. That's just what they did. And that, of course, would create adversaries also. Yes.
I'm assuming this idea that they were polytheistic is a historical fact, because, I mean, I was kind of thinking like that too. Was this right or wrong for them to not let them help? But, I was just wondering, I was trying to look to see if it said they were polytheistic. I mean, is this just kind of, are we just inferring that from history?
Yeah, if you look back, and I don't exactly remember where the reference is, but it'll be in Kings, where the Assyrians sent in the people from Assyria to occupy the land. You'll find there that they were worshiping many gods.
Well, and they also sent back a priest who wasn't really a Levitical priest, back to help them
to
recognize
appease
the God to save them from all the wild animals.
That's right. To appease the God of the land. That was the way they looked at how things were done. Well, there's a problem here. We've offended the God of the land because we don't know how to worship him in his land. So therefore, we'll send this guy and he'll fix it.
So the odds are they were polytheistic, and I can understand why the Jews, after all the punishment they had had for idol worship, to be like, no. Like, I can kind of, you know, you can understand that.
Yeah.
They're being careful.
And again, it's just stated as a fact, and it's not said whether they did the right or the wrong thing. That's just what they did. They would not let them help.
Seems to me if it says when it says the enemies of Judah.
Yeah. Well, and that, remember, if this is written by Ezra, this is Ezra's view of the people around them. And we're going to also see he's going to take chapter 4 here, and he's going to talk about several times of opposition in this chapter 4.
I think you're referring to 2 Kings 17th chapter, maybe around verse 29. Says, however, every nation continued to make gods of its own.
Yeah.
Put them in shrines in high places where the Samaritans had made every nation in the cities where they had dwelt. They feared the Lord, yet served up their own gods according to the rituals of the nation from among them, and they were carried away.
Yeah. Thank you, Dennis. That's an interesting phrase there. Feared the Lord, but served their own gods, and we have to be careful about that today. We have to be careful. All right. Moving on. Question 12. How would the Samaritans, and I think he uses that term, I don't know that they were called Samaritans at this time, but we know who he's talking about, able to stop the construction of the temple?
They wrote to him here.
Okay, that's the reference he states here in verse 7, isn't it?
Yep.
And what king is named in verse 7? Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes was the king when Nehemiah was there. Okay? We're back here in the first 6 chapters of Ezra, which is the time of Zerubbabel. Who's the king? Cyrus. I believe the answer to this is in verses 4 and 5, where it says, then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So it wasn't the letter to the king that stopped. That was much, much later. As a matter of fact, that letter to the king was out here during the building of the wall, not during the reinstituting of the temple. So that it was just the fear of the people that caused them to stop. Now, Ezra does a funny thing here in chapter 4, is that he groups together some persecution from a period of over 100 or 150 years here. And he lists it all here in chapter 4, beginning in verse 7, when he says, in the reign of Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus was really the Xerxes here, who was the one that was the husband of Esther. So he's listing, and I think, I don't know the mind of Ezra, but I think he does it for context to show that persecution occurred all during this whole time of restoration of the people, including the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of the walls and the city by Nehemiah. So that it's a little bit of a confusing, it's out of order historically here, because he collects several different ones. He lists Ahasuerus, who I said there. He lists Artaxerxes, who was the next king, beginning in verse 7. Verse 6 talks about Ahasuerus. And then he goes on and talks about Darius here too, I believe. But anyway, he groups together several oppositions over many years here in chapter 4. He also does another strange thing in chapter 4, beginning in verse 6 of chapter 4. He switches from Hebrew to Aramaic, and he writes a couple of chapters in Aramaic. It's beginning in chapter 4 and verse 8, and then going through chapter 6 and verse 18. All of that is in Aramaic. What was Aramaic?
The language is Syria and Syria.
Yeah, it was a related language to Hebrew, but was the language of Syria. And by the time of this, it had become the language of Babylon, and Persia used Aramaic. So this would have been the language that the people spoke that were in Babylon. They certainly would have known Hebrew, as Ezra did. Now remember, Ezra was a scribe, so he was an educated person, so he would have known Hebrew. So he writes part in Hebrew, part in Aramaic. And we have that. Daniel does that. Daniel has a section in Aramaic in his writing. And then the first record I could find of Aramaic was back in Genesis chapter 31, where Laban and Jacob, if you remember that Laban chased Jacob after he left, and they met up at a place, and they had a name for this place. Well, Laban's name for the place was Aramaic, whereas Jacob's name for the place was Hebrew. So you see two names there. And that's in verse 47 of Genesis 31. Then when we come over into the New Testament, we have several Aramaic words used. As a matter of fact, the cry of Jesus on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, that's Aramaic. Jesus probably spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Probably. Because those were, the Greek was the official language of Rome, funny enough. And Latin was not their official language. It was the common language of Rome, was Greek. And so we have Aramaic scattered throughout. Why do you think he uses Aramaic here? There's no right or wrong answer to this, but I don't know the answer.
He's kind of communicating what other people were writing in the letters, so they would probably have more likely spoken in Aramaic.
Yeah, he's recounting the correspondence back and forth between these kings. Cindy?
Could it be that the younger people that were brought up in captivity might have been more familiar with that language?
Could have been that too. Whether they were schooled in Hebrew or not, I don't know. You can imagine if you take your family outside of the United States and you go somewhere else, you'd have to work pretty hard to keep your kids knowing English, particularly if they lived in the society that they were surrounded by and everybody there, even though the Jews were somewhat insular. But it's just interesting, so the Bible is really written in three languages: Hebrew, Greek, and very small portions of Aramaic. And Ezra uses that here.
Could he be using that to differentiate the time period or the gaps in one side to the other?
Yeah, I don't know. We're not told why he switches. Same with Daniel. We're not told why Daniel switches to Aramaic for part of his writing. It's interesting, though, that Daniel is sort of in the same period as Ezra, a little bit earlier, but in the same period, Babylonian captivity times. So, and they're using the language. And then by the time we come to the New Testament, Aramaic is pretty much the common language of the Jews. So they don't speak so much Hebrew as they do Aramaic.
Could have avoided any accusations of mistranslation.
Okay. Yep. To be sure that Babylonians understood, or the people that spoke it. Yeah, maybe so. All right, just an interesting thing there. But remember, when you're reading in chapter 4, and let me go back there just a moment. He seems to end that in verse 23, because then in verse 24 he says, "Then the work on the house of God that is in Jerusalem stopped. It ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia." Let me go back to my chart again. So he's saying it stopped here, around about 534 or 535, and then it didn't resume till out here during the reign of Darius. And it was finished during his reign. We'll get to that in just a moment as far as the timing of that. But they laid the foundation to great enthusiasm, and then became afraid somewhat of the people. All right, question 13 says, what caused the Persian officials to stop the work? Now, this is in the section that's non-historical. So that you'll notice this verse 7 says, "In the days of Artaxerxes." Artaxerxes was the king that Nehemiah served as cupbearer. So this would have been during the time of Nehemiah. And so this stopping of the work would have been the stopping of the work of, why are you laughing? Did I get it wrong?
No, I said this is where I got confused.
Yeah, well, it's easy to get confused because he's just collecting some things together. So Artaxerxes would have been the king during Nehemiah's time. So this would be the work on the wall that we're talking about, not the work on the temple. The work on the temple had already stopped because the people were afraid. So this question is, why were they able to stop? Or what caused the Persian officials to stop the work?
Jealousy.
Jealousy. What do they say in their letter here in verses 15 and 16?
These are rebellious people.
This is a rebellious city. Has been throughout history. Been led by strong kings. Is that true? There is truth in that. At times there were strong kings in Jerusalem, and they did rebel. Even after the kings had taken oaths to the Babylonians, for instance, to pay tribute, there had been at least 3 of the kings who rose up and stopped. So this would have been part of the records that the Persians had gotten from the Babylonians. Do we need to open the doors? Do you think? Yeah, it seems to be a bit stuffy. Please open the doors.
They also accused them of ultimately damaging the revenues of the king.
Yes.
That would have got them.
If you want to get to a politician, where do you get to him? In the pocketbook. Yeah. So, but is there truth in that? There's some truth in that because they stopped the tribute when these kings rebelled. So history would have reflected that, although that wouldn't have been always the typical. The typical was that most of the kings continued to pay their tribute. But if you're trying to make a case, what do you pick out?
You cherry pick for that.
Yeah. You pick the worst ones, or the best ones, whatever case you're trying to make. So that's what they did there, and that's why they said that to the king. It was true at times. All right, and then number 14. When was construction on the temple stopped, and for how long?
You said it a couple of times. It's about 535 BC for about 14 years.
Yeah, I read the verse here, verse 24. The work on the house of the God that is in Jerusalem stopped, and it ceased until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So they were forced by the local authorities, to stop, and that was in the 2nd year of Darius my chart's not up there still, but that would have been out about 520 BC. So it was stopped for 14 or 15 years. The work on the temple was stopped. All right. I want to come back to question 4. Question 4 says, why did the Jews feel the need for worship to begin?
Verse 3 says the fear of the people around them.
For fear of the people around them. So what's the connection between worship and fear? Or lack of?
Petitioning God for protection, I would assume.
Okay. Bring them closer to God and His protection.
9/11.
9/11. People sure professed in any way to be closer to God after a disaster, didn't they? And you remember that's verse 3, and then verses 4 and 5 of chapter 4 says, the people of the land discouraged the people in Judah and made them afraid to build and bribed counselors. So it didn't work. It didn't work. They didn't overcome their fear of the people, and they stopped work on the temple. Now, my question to you is there still a connection between worship and fear, or lack of, today?
Certain parts of the world is sure don't.
In parts of the world? What about this part of the world? This is where we live. It's always where you're from.
from our authorities, not really, but sometimes there's a lack of fear of the Lord in the way people worship.
Okay?
We tend to serve God or worship God most when we're most sober-minded, I guess, kind of when something bad is going on in our lives, it tends to drive us to reconnect with.
Well, that's why Dan mentioned 9/11 here. That's, that drove a lot of people at least to profess God.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's almost an element of appeasement in that kind of worship.
Yeah, we've done something wrong, we've got to appease God. That's the same sort of thing as the bringing in the priest back in the land, wasn't it?
They're going to go to a house of peace, or house of mourning instead of a house of peace.
Okay. Why do we worship God today? Commanded us to? Always a good reason?
Because we love Him, and He loves us.
We love Him, He loves us. It's our response. Worship is our response to God and who He is. And if we do that, will we overcome our fear?
We practice this because I think what hinders us is the people around us. I mean,
isn't that what hindered them?
yeah. And that's what I'm saying. I mean, again, we have to think, are we talking about worship on only the first day of the week, or worshiping God in our daily lives? And it's a lot harder when everybody around you is going to look at you and go.
First John says love drives out fear.
Yeah. Yes, Ben.
Well, so I was thinking, like in Ryan's lesson this morning, he talked about the more you pray, the closer you get to God, the more you strengthen the relationship, and the less tolling everything else seems to be on.
Yeah. Again, think of these people in Jerusalem. What were they afraid of?
People around them.
People around them to do what? Harm them? Kill them?
They had went into exile though because of their disobedience. Originally, so you have to ask: is their obedience, or even today our obedience, more out of fear of punishment versus love of God to obey Him out of love? Is it because of love or because of fear? Probably a balance in there of a little of both.
Yeah, the answer is yes, probably.
Yeah, but I mean, going back, that they just come out of exile and they went into exile because of their disobedience. I think it speaks to the heart of their obedience. Is it in fear or is it in love?
Yeah, the thing, Adam, did you have a comment?
I was just going to remind us of Hebrews 13:6. The Lord is my helper; I will not fear. What can man do to me?
Yeah, and that's a key thing, because what can man do to you? The worst man can do to you is torture you and kill you, which would hurt, I'm sure. But that's the worst. And what the Bible teaches us is the one we should really fear is the one that can destroy us spiritually. And that's us if we don't stay with God. These people are just like we are. They have the same fears that we have. And, somebody has defined courage as action in the face of fear. Fear is not necessarily a wrong emotion unless it produces the wrong action. And that's where worship helps us, I believe, is that worship helps us to focus on God instead of ourselves and our fears. Yes, Cindy?
And trust will grow. I mean, God showed them through the fulfillment of prophecy and being able to be sent back after He promised He would send them back. Well, if you think about it, if you went back there and everything was a piece of cake, would your faith grow in? Where they had opposition and they had to trust God and keep on going.
Yeah, you find throughout the history of the Jews, and probably throughout the history of John and of Cindy, is that we are spiritually weakest when we're prospering. And we're spiritually stronger when we're sort of under stress or under strife. And that seems to be true of people.
There's reason the Lord tells us to count it all joy when you're encountering various trials. There's a lot inside that. It's not a simple thing.
And joy and happiness are different, aren't they? Happy is because of what happens to us, whereas joy is a decision that we make. It's a choice. All right. Any other comments or thoughts on chapters 3 and 4?
I can't help but think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. A lot of times when we're fearful of something, we want to compromise our worship to God and say, well, I can still do it this way, or I don't have to do it this way. I want to compromise that. But when we put God first and not try to protect ourselves, but do what He says first, then it will turn out all right.
Yeah. And their statement to Nebuchadnezzar is interesting too. Our God can deliver us. But even if He does not, we will not bow down to your idol, to your image. And that should be sort of our attitude also. So when you're reading about these people, just think of you and how it applies to you. And that's what I've tried to do here. All right. Wednesday, we will continue with lesson 2. So if you raised your hand earlier that you hadn't done your lesson, you have another chance between now and Wednesday, because we're going to talk about chapters 5 and 6, which is also covered here in lesson 2.
Question.
Yes.
When they're doing their worship, their first worship, it said, it's curious for me, according to the directions of David, why not to the gods?
Because David was the one that set up the singers and the players. So what in that section, what they're talking about there is that the priests came forth and the Levites and the cymbals and the horns and so on and so forth. David was the one that ordered that in the temple worship, or tabernacle and then the temple worship. He was the one that set up all those singers. And I think that's why they refer to David there.
So, I mean, I was just curious. I mean, I was thinking they would want to go back to the original law as far as exactly how we get.
And I believe they were. But again, we don't. It's not until David that he organizes all the singers and players in the temple service. So I think that's why they refer to David there.
As directed by God.
David was directed by God.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Anything else?
Yes, did you
Yes.
ever read, or were the scrolls taken away and brought back?
The scrolls. What are
From
scrolls?
the temple, the law,
Oh.
you know, is there any? I was just curious.
I believe that, this is just my belief and just reading, that it seems like that the copies of the Torah, for instance, the first 5 books, and probably some of the prophets, there were several copies of those. There wasn't just one copy of those, and many people would have taken those with them into exile. What happened to the ones in the temple, we're not told. Just like the ark, I always wondered, I know Indiana Jones found it, and I know that he says it's in a government warehouse somewhere, but I'm not so sure about that.
They stripped everything, the gold from everything.
Yes. Well, and the inside of the temple was covered in gold. Probably not at the time the Babylonians came, but it had been stacked a few times before that. All right. Thank you. Chapters 5 and 6 on Wednesday.
They didn't mention bronze either.
Bronze was just working.
All the bronze that they had.
You remember during the reign of Solomon, it said silver was as common as stone.
I've seen bronze used, like I've always meant that.
Mike, would you turn that monitor off as you go last? Thank you. Thanks for your input. Means you're involved. Means you're engaged. So do you?
A little in my head. But I am good. I need to be challenged.
They can feel free. And we just now gotta remember to slow down. You can't live like that. For a month or so. Well, they want that, it's busy, not lifting and bending. Or a gallon of milk. Yeah, it says to me like 5 pounds, 5 gallons of milk. 6 pounds usually coming on milk. So that's a good thing to remember, like, you can actually eat nice good and like, yeah. These are church bag weights on that, you know, so like, take it for it. Don't remind them, Dad, I got that. No, you do it, I'll send you over, you know. That's right, I call those boys. It is a good thing to have a lot of help, that's for sure.
And I'm sure was calling you today, I didn't know for sure where you good.
I went way over time.
I wasn't looking, that was great.
Well, good, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Hi, Mary. I don't need to interrupt, I'm sure back to you. Good, okay. So that, I mean, recovery is sort of a moot point then.
Well, the recovery enforcement is don't do anything stupid.
Yeah.
So that's gonna be the hard conversation. Like 5 pounds for a month. Yeah, that's not a lot.
Yeah.
That's not a lot. I'm good, yeah. I do. Like the kids, as soon as I look up, I was doing this, like, oh,